Next week, Americans begin the process of choosing a Republican nominee to face President Obama. On this edition of Inside Story US 2012, we look at the frontrunners in the race and examine the differences and similarities in their policies. Hello, I'm Schechter. It's just days to go before residents of Iowa go to the polls in what's known as a caucus vote. Over the course of the next few months, each state will have its say in choosing the eventual Republican presidential candidate. The key issue facing the 6 candidates before the January 3rd poll has been the US's troubled economy. All the Republican hopefuls say they want to reduce taxes, create jobs, and shrink the government, but they do disagree on the details of how to achieve that. Starker differences are on display about foreign policy, America's role in the world, the size of the military, and where threats to future security actually lie have proved contentious. There are 3 clear frontrunners in Iowa. Mitt Romney, former governor of Massachusetts. He made a failed run for president in 2008, losing eventually the nomination to John McCain. Then there's the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Newt Gingrich. He's perhaps best remembered for his role in the Republican victory in the 1994 congressional election. And there's Texas Congressman Ron Paul. He previously ran for president for the Libertarian Party in 1988, and in 2008 he was also a candidate for the Republican nomination. So where do the candidates stand on foreign policy and economic policy? To discuss this, in the studio we're joined by Jonathan Strong. He's a political reporter for the Capitol Hill newspaper Roll Call. In Syracuse, in New York State, we're joined by Danny Schechter. He's an Emmy Award-winning journalist, author and filmmaker. He also contributes to the weblog newsdissector.com. And also in the studio with us is John Feffer from Foreign Policy in Focus. Jonathan Strong, then, let's begin with you. We'll begin with the economy. Very much based on taxes. Fundamental principles seem to be the same amongst the 3 main frontrunners. Supply-side economics, trickle-down economics, someone might call it, and so forth.
There's a number of areas in which all of the candidates, not just the top 3, but all of them agree. They want to significantly curtail government regulation of the financial sector for the environment. They all want to, many of them want to do some kind of flat tax plan to kind of reform the tax system. They all want to repeal the president's health care law. But some of the candidates who are further down in the second tier have some of the more bold or innovative approaches, and you know, you have Romney taking a cautious approach compared to them.
Actually, we have a quote from Romney from a recent campaign appearance, which kind of sums up the philosophy that's at play here.
I would like to see our tax rates flatter. I'd like to see our code simpler. I'd like to see the special breaks that we have in the code taken out. That's one of the reasons why I take the corporate rate from 35 down to 25, is to take out some of the special deals that are there. With regards to our tax code, what I want to do is to take our precious dollars as a nation and focus them on the people in this country that have been hurt the most, and that's the middle class.
So, I mean, the theory is, though, if you give the entrepreneurial class and the business class the means, they will bring America back to prosperity, basically.
Right, and also involved in tax reform, cutting out loopholes that benefit targeted sectors of the economy. And the idea behind those would be, we want to incentivize this behavior or that behavior, but over time it becomes cumbersome and complicated. And when you remove all of those, the idea is that you would increase the efficiency of the economy.
So hence a flat rate on corporate tax, basically. And given that there's enormous loss of revenue to the government, where does the government receive its revenue? I mean, there's been much talk about the deficit and so forth, but what's this going to do for the deficit?
Well, for some of the candidates, they have kind of a plausible claim that this would be revenue neutral, is the best case scenario in terms of the deficit. For other candidates, for instance, Newt Gingrich, it's almost laughable for him to claim, as he has, that it's revenue neutral. In fact, it's going to result in a loss of revenue, significant loss of revenue.
I mean, there was also one study of Romney's plan that suggested, I mean, he's actually going to mandate a certain amount, a percentage of GDP, which can be spent by the government. Is that correct as well? So,
right.
And the amount of revenue he's getting in is going to be fundamentally less. It's going to be like 16% of GDP.
Which is lower than the
And he wants to spend 20% of GDP. So how does that work then?
It's a difficulty that all the candidates have to face because we have significant financial liabilities in the coming decades from the entitlement programs.
All right, Danny Schechter then. So those are the kind of fundamental That's the fundamental economic framework. What's the effect going to be? Is this going to create jobs?
Well, first of all, it won't create jobs. Second of all, it's not talking about the real economic crisis in our country. It's not talking about economic inequality, which has grown dramatically. It's not talking about the role of Wall Street and the various Wall Street operators who violated various laws and leading to the crisis that we've been experiencing and continue to experience. You know, it's important to note, just yesterday, the New York Times, one of their columnists basically said, forget about Iowa. It means nothing. It's totally insignificant. It will have no impact on the election going forward. It's all a popularity contest. It's all a function of who has done the most groundwork in that state to pull out their supporters. These caucuses turn out very small numbers of people relative to the overall election.
So Danny, let's forget about Iowa there.
Impression in the news.
But give us your analysis then of the economic philosophy underpinning the actual policies. You know, I think you're right. Let's forget about Iowa. So examine then this as an economic model going forward, actually, and indeed how it differs from the model we have currently under President Obama.
Well, I just saw a survey of economics professors who teach Economics 101 at leading universities. And they basically said that on the basis of their plans, all of these candidates would flunk Economics 101 because they don't know what they're talking about. Their proposals are not very well thought out. Really, it's all about creating an impression that the politician knows what he's talking about, knows what he's doing. Most people don't judge it on the basis of their plans and policies. They judge it on the basis of their personalities. You know, one person is quoted as saying, well, my father's a businessman, Romney is a businessman, he looks like a businessman, therefore I support him. Somebody else said, Ron Paul looks like somebody in a park giving out bread to pigeons. You know, in other words, all of this, we in the media take all of these policy differences and programs and proposals very seriously, but most of it goes over the head of most of the voters.
Let's try and take it seriously then and see what this actually would mean for the U.S. economy. Jonathan Strong.
Okay.
So I think Danny's right about the voters, that they're kind of going on these impressions of the candidates. But there's a core philosophical dispute on these economic issues, and that is that all of the GOP candidates have rejected the mainstream Keynesian theory that undergirded the stimulus plan that President Obama passed, which is that you need the government to spend money in the absence of the economic growth during the recession to make up for that lost production. And they've all said that no, in fact, we need to be cutting spending, particularly because the deficits are threatening the future of the economy.
What do you make of that, John Feffer?
One exception, that would be the military.
Jonathan, but what don't they want to cut? They don't want to cut the defense budget, which is huge. They don't want to really trim back on various programs that benefit corporations that they like and support them. So it's completely hypocritical here. You know, they're against big government except when they can use big government. They all want more executive authority, which is basically government should be, a president should be in a dominant position of determining what happens in the future.
They would say
all of their positions are you know, kind of laced through with hypocrisy.
They would say that that national defense is a core constitutional responsibility of the government. In other words, they say that is what the government ought to be doing, national defense, so sure, we should spend money.
Because we have to be very careful about throwing these pronouns around, though, they would say, because of course Ron Paul does stand out and is very different, certainly on defense perhaps as well. You know, he wants to reduce the military footprint and reduce the size of the military, and if we don't make that clear, my inbox is going to go completely crazy.
He's consistently laissez-faire.
Right.
I mean, we're essentially identifying the GOP
But when you talk about a military budget,
as laissez-faire.
You're talking about a budget that's completely inflated. It's a budget filled with corruption, filled with, you know, special deals for contractors and other companies. It's not as if it's objectively planned to defend the United States. It's a complete mess, and even the people.
And I think isn't that what Ron Paul is getting at? Isn't that what Ron Paul is getting at when he talks about slashing the military budget?
Yeah, yes, he is. He's also questioning how the budget is spent. Should we be intervening in other countries? Should we be going to war with other places?
Right.
And he's questioning that, which of course upsets all the other Republican candidates.
Well, actually, just to concentrate on Ron Paul, since we're talking about him right now, Danny Schechter. I mean, there's often a soft spot for Ron Paul. I'm not sure how I got so friendly with him. For Ron Paul, on the left and amongst progressives, particularly for his foreign policy, which you alluded to. But on economic issues, which is what we're concentrating on right at this moment, though, do you see the same sort of common ground when you actually look at the small print of what he is suggesting?
Well, you know, I've been covering the Occupy Wall Street movement, and there are many people there who support Ron Paul because he has taken a strong stand on the Federal Reserve Bank. He wants to end the Fed or phase the Federal Reserve Bank and its powers out. He favors, you know, a kind of gold-based economy, which others think is crazy. Others question his total basic negativity towards the Federal Reserve Bank. I mean, Governor Perry of Texas has called Ben Bernanke a traitor, basically. So that issue has been used as a symbolic straw man.
But doesn't he have a point?
Big government and big business.
Shouldn't there be more transparency with the Federal Reserve? Do we really know what's going on? Haven't they been spending billions of dollars of our money?
Absolutely, there should, and that's why Ron Paul, in questioning the Fed budget and wanting to make it more transparent, was joined by Barney Frank and by many Democrats who wanted to reveal what the Fed was actually doing. And because of Bloomberg News and their lawsuit, we found out that trillions of dollars were spent in bailing out banks all over the world by the Fed without the American people knowing anything about it.
So those are the sort of issues that progressives can see some common ground
But people don't understand how radical Ron Paul's economic proposal really is. He has a paper, I mean, he has it on paper, cut $1 trillion in spending over 1 year.
Where are those cuts going to take place?
He's going to eliminate 5 federal agencies and cut across the board everywhere else. I mean, it's like, it's way, way further than any other Republican candidate.
So what will that mean for education, for housing, for social programs, as far as we can tell?
I mean, cuts in every area. Cuts that would never be able to pass
So what does that mean for the 99%, I suppose, is the question?
It doesn't mean anything because it would never happen. It would never actually happen
But if this is put into practice, it would mean trouble for the 99%.
I mean, I think that's an important point that you're making. I think that's an important point because we're talking about symbolic cuts, not real cuts. These are election year posturing by candidates, basically saying to the audience, like me, because I'm going to do all these things, which they, of course, will not do and will not be able to do.
Right, but still, I think we are, again, we're looking, you know, no matter how disillusioned you all seem to be about the political system, which I can perhaps understand, I mean, we are trying to look at, see how serious these platforms are. I mean, in the end, though, is Ron Paul, Ron Paul is basically advocating an extreme form of social Darwinism. Would that be the correct way of putting it, Danny Schechter?
He is, and it's a lot of demagoguery here. There's a lot of symbolic posturing and sloganizing about big government and the like. Ron Paul, to his credit, or Dr. Paul, as they like to call him, you know, has been consistently critical of American military adventures overseas. He has tried to cut that back. He is against it. And nobody else in the Republican Party wants to even talk about that issue. Hence, he's been consigned to the category of a kook. But I think he could win in Iowa, which will give his campaign a lot more national credibility.
How different then is Romney to Obama on the economy, would you say then?
He's different on the margin.
Well, I mean, personally,
a moment, Danny. Let's get Jonathan Strong first.
Romney has a 59-point plan to reform the economy that includes lowering taxes. He includes some kind of populist measures that would go after China for manipulating currency, for instance, and a number of other places. He would repeal the president's healthcare law. He would curtail regulations. But it's not quite as significant a gap as you have between him and the other candidates.
Right, exactly. So it's that sort of center-right sort of framework still, perhaps, that even President Obama.
You know, it's easy to bash China. It's easy to bash China, you know, in an election. But of course, the United States already imposed, you know, higher tariffs on China, for example, on the importation of tires. Now China has come back and imposed new tariffs on American automobiles. So once you start a trade war, it's not clear that you're going to win, particularly when your economy is in as bad shape as ours is. The Chinese economy relatively seems to be doing a lot better.
Actually, this does lead to an interesting question very quickly on the economy then.
Right now is very good.
How much real fundamental change on the economy can there be? There is always an argument, though, that actually presidents don't have that much leeway on economic matters necessarily. They do on foreign policy. But on the economy, frankly, they're just going to stick to the fundamental framework that's set for them.
That's what the
John Feffer, you might.
I mean, at a time of crisis, you see that they have quite a...
Obama wants to
Danny, just a moment.
create jobs, he can.
During a time of crisis, the president has a great deal of leeway, as we saw with Obama and the stimulus package, or with Reagan and what he did in terms of reorienting the American economy.
But even Obama, they had his hands tied and didn't go for aggressive job creation.
Didn't get as much as he wanted, absolutely.
Well, we're not sure whether he even wanted it. Perhaps he does. There is a certain economic ideology that does hold sway for both parties.
There's no question that a president has greater leeway when it comes to foreign policy, but I think it would be a mistake to look at the Republican candidates' economic proposals as simply demagoguery.
Right.
I mean, we saw what Reagan campaigned on, we saw what George W. Bush campaigned on. I'm not talking about foreign policy for the moment, but economics. And we did see some significant translation of those ideas into practice. So yes, some of it is for the groundlings, there's no question about it, but there is a carryover both in terms of theory and in terms of practice.
All right, let's carry over now to foreign policy, and actually some of these themes do come in.
Well, what's happened since? Excuse me, John, what's happened since? What's happened since is a major financial crisis, 2007, market meltdown, 2008, market meltdown, European crisis continuing. I mean, the idea that these guys have any solutions to these serious problems is really a joke.
Solutions I'm not talking about. I'm only talking about looking at what they propose and what they intend to implement when they become president. What happens to those policies when they implement them, well, of course, we saw the tremendous, the terrible effects of what happened with Reagan's economic policies or George W. Bush's
And Danny,
policies.
surely you'd accept that even further deregulation of the financial markets and Wall Street and so forth would be disastrous, wouldn't it? I mean, that would have a real effect, I would imagine. Would be
I
your
think
argument.
it would be disastrous, but that's what they want. That's
Right.
what they claim to want. We've had no serious financial reform since 2007, and it doesn't look like we're going to get any, really. Tinkering around here and there, but
with
not
respect,
any
there was a
efforts
giant
to deal
financial
with this
reform law.
crisis.
Dodd-Frank is a very major piece of legislation that went through the Congress and has been signed.
We're going to move on there, but I'm sure, but I can summarize what Danny's going to say there. That it didn't go far enough. But,
Which has been sabotaged by the lobbyists
and was
for
sabotaged.
the banks.
All right, foreign policy, before you sabotage my discussion. Romney, then, let's begin with him. He's pretty much like Obama, basically, is what I can tell from his thing. Of course, he wants to reverse any cuts in defense, but on the Middle East, on Afghanistan, on the recognition of China and the Pacific as an important area, on Afghanistan, and so forth, he does seem to be pretty much in the Obama foreign policy mode.
He's more hawkish in a number of respects. He's more cautious about Afghanistan, bringing troops home from Afghanistan. He's more cautious about Iraq. He's more hawkish about Iran, and I think he would probably.
How can he be more hawkish than I mean, in that center ground that Romney and Obama inhabit? John Feffer. I mean, do they really
Absolutely.
differ?
I mean, Romney has talked about not just having military option on the table, but actually considering it as part of his foreign policy. And this is a difficult. Yeah, well, yes, this is a difficulty for all the Republican candidates, is to somehow out-hawk Obama, because in many respects, Obama has taken foreign policy off the table for the Republican candidates because he has, in many cases, continued.
They want to be more Israeli than Obama.
But even there, I mean, as the Israeli government has said, they're enjoying the best relations with the United States perhaps ever. So Obama has actually. He's effectively taken that issue off the table, although the Republican candidates, as Danny points out, have done as much as they can to try to prove that they're the much bigger friends.
So Romney's foreign policy is an Obama foreign policy with Republican characteristics, perhaps? I mean, is that how we could?
Well, here's a palpable difference that they have. In North Korea, Romney is urging regime change now that the dictator has died there, and Obama's not. I mean, it's subtle differences on some of these things, but I think the real world situation we would find is Israel bombing Iran on the nuclear facilities, not the U.S. That's not the discussion that's actually happening. And if that were to happen, then Romney would support Israel more than I would think Obama would.
But really, do you really think that if Israel bombs, won't Obama simply go along with the whole business too? John Feffer?
It's hard to imagine in practical terms the Republicans aligning themselves more closely with Israel.
Right.
The Obama administration has gone out of its way to basically push against Palestinian attempts at statehood, continue the $3 billion or so we provide Israel every year. I mean, it is as much a pro-Israel position as you can have without maybe calling up Netanyahu and asking him for his approval before the United States implements policy.
Which is what Mitt Romney said.
Exactly.
Okay, well, let's go to Gingrich then. Gingrich, it seems to be a very clear doctrine, and evil is evil, sort of a Manichaean struggle against good and evil, evil being Islam, whether it's Al-Qaeda or the Palestinians, Iran, and so forth.
I think it's important also to note that Mitt Romney is kind of the product of his positions are the product of a lot of people, a lot of his advisors and a foreign policy establishment on the right, whereas Newt Gingrich is more of his own man. He's never been somebody who relies principally on the advice of a number of advisors as an established process for developing its policies. He kind of goes off, you know, he'll speak off the cuff, and if you had a President Gingrich, that would be a constant concern. He wings it. You're right. He wings
Electromagnetic pulse, lunar colony.
Right.
I mean, some
John
pretty
Bolton
out
as
there
Secretary of
ideas.
State.
That exactly.
Which actually might have been an illegal statement for him to make.
Maybe we should have the Republican convention on the moon. You know, that might be a good idea.
And Gingrich also said that he would perhaps give Iranians iPhones so that they could organize and perhaps document their bombing by America.
In some sense,
later.
it's an indication of how few foreign policy issues the Republicans have available to them.
But isn't there a serious point, though, that there is a resurgence of this neoconservative framework, which perhaps never entirely went away under Obama, actually, it has to be said, looking at the practical nature of his policy there. But isn't that undercurrent is still there, basically?
We are seeing the return of the Vulcans, and it's as advisors, for the most part. I mean, so their influence is felt only here and there, not necessarily in a coherent vision. But I think, yes, some of the ideas about democratization, about militarization, about increasing a military budget, a kind of evangelism for the United States, and a pushback against the Obama administration as an appeaser and as an apologist, trying to paint the Obama administration into that corner when in fact it's quite difficult to do that.
All right, so then we are looking for real difference, and of course then we do go
and the Obama administration is moving right to the right, straight to the right.
So then we have Ron Paul.
I don't know what the difference between Republican doctrine and his doctrine really is.
But there is a difference between Ron Paul's doctrine of isolationism, and he's clearly struck a real chord across the country. Let's take a look at one of his recent speeches on this topic.
Why do we have to bomb so many countries? Why are we have 900 bases, 130 countries, and we're totally bankrupt? How are you going to rebuild a military when we have no money?
And it has to be said, though, I mean, I read a headline in Politico, the insider kind of newspaper in D.C., saying that foreign policy is a soft spot for Ron Paul, when actually it seems to be striking a chord, and in fact is much closer to the sort of things you'd hear from regional experts on Iran or Israel, Palestine, and so forth, and yet this is being seen as a soft spot, and the glib slogans a serious discourse.
Well, it's a soft spot if you're Rick Santorum, and Rick Santorum, I think, has identified an attack on Ron Paul as a crowd pleaser in Iowa right now.
But then help us, John Feffer, then understand Ron Paul. How do you differentiate his position of isolationism from a progressive foreign policy? Because there seem to be very many points of commonality.
Well, first of all, there's no single progressive foreign policy position. I mean, as you saw in the issue of Libya, some progressives said, hey, we have to go and we have to support folks on the ground in Libya who are trying to overthrow Gaddafi, who's no progressive. But then other progressives said, look, we're very skeptical about any kind of U.S. intervention, even if it has the cover of multilateralism. So I think there is a dividing line that runs through on the intervention issue, as well as multilateral engagement. I think Ron Paul is very suspicious of any organization that's larger than 10 people. I mean, he's always, talking about the Federal Reserve as being a conspiratorial force, but I think he's very skeptical of the UN, of any multilateral institutions, whereas progressives, there is a strong tradition of supporting multilateral engagement in the world, whether it's dealing with large issues.
Given the nature
not just progressives, American public opinion.
Absolutely.
American public opinion has supported the UN.
But Danny, as a long-time critic of American empire, we only have 20 seconds left, though, might Ron Paul's isolationism be preferable to some of that engagement, given the results of U.S. engagement for the best of intentions in the past?
To his credit, he is raising issues that nobody else wants to raise, including Obama. And in that respect, I think it's a positive for our political process.
All right, Danny Schechter. Positive note from Danny Schechter. Thank you very much, John Feffer. Thank you, Jonathan Strong. Thank you. That's our quick, brief potted, rather controversial, more controversial than expected look at the policy platforms of the candidates. Do join us again on Inside Story. Tell us what you want. Email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.